Of course, Marx believed that in a capitalist society, capital would accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people.
Issue number one was inequality, too much money in too few hands, capital accumulation. His response is, 1, shift the topic from economic inequality to hierarchy. 2, claim that hierarchy is inevitable for man and beast. 3, claim that hierarchy has nothing to do with capitalism anyway. It's quote-unquote much deeper. Again, people used to say that about slavery. Well, they had slavery in the Bible. It's much deeper. It's not just a problem with our society. Yeah, this is misdirection. Number 4, claim that people have deeper psychological and emotional problems anyway. Yeah, we may have those problems anyway, but look, this is a problem we want to solve too. 5, complain that Marx isn't interested in man's struggle with nature.
It is the case that hierarchical structures dispossess those people who are at the bottom, those creatures who are at the bottom, speaking, say, of animals.
But it is not the case that wolves in a pack become more and more unequal over time, right? It's just so stupid. There's hierarchy among lobsters. How about the bees? You know, the queen bee. Why don't we get it? Well, it's just totally irrelevant and totally stupid. The people who own property, who own even just residential property, not even getting to commercial, they get richer and richer, and the people who pay rent get poorer and poorer. Well, yeah, but you know, wolves. What? Well, yeah, but you know, bees. So what?
Human beings struggle with themselves, with the malevolence that's inside themselves, with the evil that they're capable of doing, with the spiritual and psychological warfare that goes on within them.
So his style of misdirection really reminds me of a lot of Buddhist monks, Buddhist preachers I've known, where whenever they get a challenging question, which could even be about something like slavery, they just go back to a set of well-worn kind of moral and ethical generalizations that they know the audience will sympathize with. Like, oh yeah, well, you want to ask me about capital accumulation and social inequality and economic inequality getting worse and worse. Well, you know, the real struggle is within yourself. Do people in the audience not pick up on this? How deeply dishonest this is? A lot of our conversations about politics revolve around a very simple distinction between right and wrong, good and evil, true and false. You know what you're talking about or you don't. And when you're dealing with Jordan Peterson, the main question you have to ask is this relevant or irrelevant? Is this salient or not? Is this coherent or incoherent? So I'm going to talk about, briefly, a brief example illustrating how profoundly incoherent his criticism of Karl Marx is, that it really just makes no sense, his line of reasoning on Karl Marx. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what Karl Marx has meant in my own life. But now, for something different, Jordan Peterson.
Of course, Marx believed that in a capitalist society, capital would accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people, and that actually is in keeping with the nature of hierarchical organizations. Now, the problem with that isn't so much the fact of so there's accuracy in the accusation that is a eternal form of motivation for struggle, but it's an underestimation of the seriousness of the problem because it attributes it to the structure of human societies rather than the deeper reality of the existence of hierarchical structures per se, which, as they also characterize the animal kingdom to a large degree, are clearly not only human constructions.
So he said it himself briefly, but then he immediately goes off topic, becomes incoherent, starts misdirecting and misleading the audience. He says the problem is capital accumulating in the hands of fewer and fewer people. All right. Now, capital is not just money. Capital is the ability to make money. So that can be in the form of an investment. Capital, especially as Marx discusses it, also includes ownership of the means of production. There's a Marxist phrase. You own the factory. You own the trucks that deliver things, whatever it is. Okay? So this is a very dynamic, very powerful form of inequality. It's not just income inequality. And over generations, over even a period of 100 years, inequality gets worse and worse and worse. A really quick thought experiment here, guys. This is a really good economics 101 thing. Let's say we begin with a completely equal society where everyone is paid the same wages. They do different jobs, but we just pass a law. There's a minimum wage, there's a maximum wage. Everyone in society makes $15 an hour. But some people own apartments and some people rent apartments. Let's say it's 50-50. 50% of people own all the apartments and 50% of people pay rent. what happens over 100 years? The 50% of people who pay rent get poorer and poorer and poorer, and the 50% of people who are receiving the rent money, the landlords, get richer and richer and richer. This is just one variable. Now, why? Because of capital. This is the title of Karl Marx's book. Das Kapital. This is what it's all about, right? And this is property ownership and rent is a very simple form of capital. Hey, how about owning a gold mine? How do you think that works? How do you think inequality works over time with a gold mine? Some people get richer and richer. Some people get poorer, historically. These days, the conditions for gold miners are a lot better than they were 200 years ago. But, even just the old San Francisco gold rush, it made some people rich and it made a lot of people poor. Okay, so this opens with him acknowledging the problem Karl Marx is trying to address is unequal capital accumulation. But less than 1 minute later, that clip was less than 1 minute, less than 1 minute later, he is misrepresenting the problem as the mere existence of hierarchy, something he sees as more ancient than capitalism and something that exists already in relationships between wild animals. Okay? But hierarchy and capital accumulation are not the same thing. He's misdirecting, he's deceiving the audience. Intentionally or not, it's deeply incoherent and dishonest what he's doing here. So, real quick thought experiment. The military has hierarchy, but everyone in the army could be paid the same wage. So whatever, you can just say, hey, everyone in the army is going to get $100,000 a year. It doesn't matter. Or $50,000 a year. Whatever it is, you could have one wage for everyone, right? Or if not, the inequality still has nothing to do with capital or investment, right? So even if you have a situation in the army where the lowest foot soldier, the guy who operates the machine gun, is paid the same amount as his captain, or if they have different wages, doesn't matter. Still, it's not a situation where the captain of the military, the commander, is getting richer and richer because he's employing or exploiting the lower ranks of the soldiers, because they pay rent to him, or he owns the trucks that deliver the bread, or like a taxi company. He owns the cars, and they merely do the driving, so they get paid a wage, but he makes all the profits because he owns the taxi company, he owns the cars, and they merely get paid an hourly wage. That's capital. That's inequality created by small numbers of people owning capital. So again, military has hierarchy, but not capital accumulation. They're two completely different things. Guess what? Lobsters don't have capital accumulations. Lobsters don't have banks and bank loans, so they don't pay rent. They don't have any of the features of capitalist society that Karl Marx is criticizing. So yeah, you know what? There's inequality amongst wolves, and there's inequality in the army. There's inequality. You could have, again, doctors in a hospital. You could have a whole hospital where everyone earns the same amount of money, or you could have a hospital where the surgeon earns more than the nurse. But either way, it's not the case that the doctor is exploiting the nurse, that there's capital ownership, where the doctor says, hey, I own the equipment, so you have to pay me. Whatever it is different. And we're not going to get a direct or honest answer out of Jordan Peterson here.
That's the next problem. It's that, this ancient problem of hierarchical structure is clearly not attributable to capitalism, because it existed long in human history before capitalism existed, and then it predated human history itself. So the question then arises, why would you necessarily, at least implicitly, link the class struggle with capitalism, given that it's a far deeper problem?
Karl Marx does not uniquely link class struggle to capitalism. And Peterson is probably not intentionally lying here, but he is deceiving the audience. Karl Marx describes the whole of human history, going back to ancient Greece and Rome, in terms of class struggle. This is an extremely repetitive and obvious theme in Marx's writing. It isn't something subtle or contested. Okay? And in fact, this reflects the extent to which Marx's work really is inspired by and derivative of Aristotle.
And now, it's also, you've got to understand that this is a deeper problem for people on the left, not just for people on the right. It is the case that hierarchical structures dispossess those people who are at the bottom, those creatures who are at the bottom, speaking, say, of animals, but those people who are at the bottom, and that is a fundamental existential problem.
Yes, a fundamental existential problem. But it is not the case that wolves in a pack become more and more unequal over time, right? It's just so stupid. stupid. Oh yeah, moose in the woods are not equal, right? There's hierarchy among lobsters. How about the bees? The queen bee. Why don't we get it? Well, it's just totally irrelevant and totally stupid. Anyway, sorry. So what do you think? Oh yeah, it's a problem that in Japan, the people who own property, who own even just residential property, not even getting to commercial, they get richer and richer, and the people who pay rent get poorer and poorer. Well, yeah, but wolves. What? Well, yeah, but bees. So what? It's irrelevant. Well, yeah, but this is more ancient than capitalism. So what? That's the problem we're talking about. Yeah, you know what? They had landlords in ancient Rome too. Guess what? This is the problem we want to talk about, and this is one of the things that still makes Marx a little bit relevant today in the 21st century. Not so terribly relevant in my opinion, but hey. Some people read Marx, some people read Aristotle, some people read both. So what is he doing here? He's claiming that these problems are really, quote-unquote, existential problems. Gee, that sounds like it's just a problem you don't want to solve, or you don't want to take seriously, or you don't want to deal with. Well, the rent is too high in Tokyo, and people making minimum wage live these terrible lives. Well, yeah, but, look at bees. Look at... think about it existentially, really? Okay, I think we'd rather rise up and have a revolution and establish a minimum wage, or elect Bernie Sanders and raise the minimum wage, or lower the cost of rent. Thanks for your advice about the wolves and the bees, homie. So what? You're also claiming that hierarchy, not economic inequality and not capital accumulation, but just bare hierarchy, is an inevitable aspect of life on Earth for man and beast. So what? Would you accept the same argument if it were offered as a justification of slavery? If somebody were discussing the economics and legality of slavery, would you accept the argument that just said, oh, well, there will always be inequality, just look at the animals?
But the other thing that Marx didn't seem to take into account is that there are far more reasons that human beings struggle than their economic class struggle, even if you build the hierarchical idea into that, which is a more comprehensive way of thinking about it. Human beings struggle with themselves, with the malevolence that's inside themselves, with the evil that they're capable of doing, with the spiritual and psychological warfare that goes on within them.
So his style of misdirection really reminds me of a lot of Buddhist monks, Buddhist preachers I've known, where whenever they get a challenging question, which could even be about something like slavery, they just go back to a set of well-worn kind of moral and ethical generalizations that they know the audience will sympathize with. Like, oh yeah, well, you want to ask me about capital accumulation and social inequality and economic inequality getting worse and worse. Well, the real struggle is within yourself. Do people in the audience not pick up on this? How deeply dishonest this is? It's just misdirection. Nobody would accept this as a coherent argument on slavery, democracy, or any other topic. So what if he was responding saying, well, you raised this specific issue of slavery, but you should realize that slavery is just one problem people are struggling with. That's the word he used. It's just one problem. I mean, they're also struggling with all kinds of dark malevolence within themselves. Well, yeah, right, but this was supposed to be a response on the issue of slavery, right? Well, you raised this one specific issue of North Koreans having the right to vote, but that's just one problem. What about the darkness of the human heart? What about psychological problems? What about the malevolence within ourselves we're struggling with? Yeah, right. Well, what I'm interested in today is the future of North Korea, and what all of us are interested in is how we're going to cope with social inequality, poverty. Poverty is really the issue here, whether we're going to call on Karl Marx as a source textbook for that or not.
And we're also actually always at odds with nature, and this never seems to show up in Marx.
So this is all he wants to do. He just wants to try to derail the conversation. This is only like 2 minutes into his lecture. He's like derailing himself repeatedly. Issue number 1 was inequality, too much money in too few hands, capital accumulation. His response is 1, shift the topic from economic inequality to hierarchy. 2, claim that hierarchy is inevitable for man and beast. 3, claim that hierarchy has nothing to do with capitalism anyway. It's quote-unquote much deeper. Again, people used to say that about slavery. Well, they had slavery in the Bible. It's much deeper. It's not just a problem with our society. Yeah, this is misdirection. Number 4, claim that people have deeper psychological and emotional problems anyway. Yeah, we may have those problems anyway, but look, this is a problem we want to solve too. 5, complain that Marx isn't interested in man's struggle with nature. This is worse than being totally irrelevant. This is pure misdirection. It would work equally as well as an excuse for anything else. And when I say equally well, I mean equally poorly.
If human beings have a problem, it's because there's a class struggle that's essentially economic. It's like, no, human beings have problems because we come into life starving and lonesome. And we have to solve that problem continually, and we make our social arrangements, at least in part, to ameliorate that, as well as to, well, upon occasion, exacerbate it. And so there's also very little understanding in the Communist Manifesto that any of the, like, say, hierarchical organizations that human beings have put together might have a positive element. And that's an absolute catastrophe, because hierarchical structures are actually necessary to solve complicated social problems. We have to organize ourselves in some manner, and you have to give the devil his due. And so it is the case that hierarchies dispossess people, and that's a big problem. That's the fundamental problem of inequality. But it's also the case that hierarchies happen to be a very efficient way of distributing resources.
So what is the difference between the organization of the military and the organization of a school? What is the difference between the organization of a hospital and the organization of a nightclub? What is the difference between the organization of a casino and the organization of parliament? A gold mine, a hairdresser's salon, a taxi company. What's the difference between the organization of the production of works of art, the way a painter works in a studio, and the organization of a shipping dock? How are we going to organize our society? These are really meaningful and deep questions. You know, do you want to live in a society where the majority of people, most of the time, are making decisions on the basis of dire economic need? Or what? I mean, it's just ridiculous. You say, oh, well, once you solve the poverty and dire economic need, people are still going to be wrestling with these dark psychological problems and irrelevance. Yeah, great. Let's get to that. You know what? Let's get to the point. I've lived in third world countries. You know what? You're right. People really don't have much time to reflect on their psychological problems and their dark, inner malevolence when, their whole lives are just dominated by the struggle to put bread in their mouths. Yeah, great idea.
And it's finally the case that human hierarchies are not fundamentally predicated on power. And I would say the biological, anthropological data on that are crystal clear. You don't rise to a position of authority that's reliable in a human society primarily by exploiting other people. It's a very unstable means of obtaining power. So that's a problem.
So the audience laughs.
So that's a problem.
The audience laughs. For good reason. Oh, nobody gets rich by exploiting other people anymore. I've never heard of anything like that. This is 2019. Who gets rich off the exploitation of others? It's very unstable. You shouldn't become a multimillionaire by exploiting other people. It's very unstable.
Of course, Marx believed that in a capitalist society, capital would accumulate in the hands of fewer and fewer people.
Was this problem solved? Was this problem even addressed? I mean, he opened by at least sincerely defining that one problem: inequality means too much money in too few hands, capital accumulation, etc. Did we learn why Marx was wrong about this issue or any issue in the opening argument? No, we did not. We just got a bunch of completely incoherent and self-indulgent crap. Should I just do a separate video? I guess you just do a separate video. I don't know. My parents were communists. My parents were Marxists. Reading Karl Marx was supposed to be a big deal for me, and in a sense it was. My mother didn't just respect Marx. She was a little bit afraid of Marx. Like, the way she even handled the book and talked about the book, you could tell she thought this really had the power to corrupt people and dominate your life and totally change who you are and stuff. And maybe that was because that was her own experience, or maybe that was because back when she was a communist, when she was surrounded by other far left-wing people, she saw the way their lives changed. Now, is it too much to say their lives changed because of that book? Like they read that book. Maybe they talked about their own lives in terms of, well, this is what I was like before I read Karl Marx, and then in university they read Karl Marx and their whole life changed. For whatever reason, I remember my mother really regarded Marx that way. With this kind of, it really was like a hallowed Bible, Das Kapital, that she was very, in some ways proud of, in some ways afraid of. And she was kind of worried about what would happen to me when I finally read Marx. She really picked up the vibe there. My father's attitude a little bit different. My father was both more of a Stalinist and more of a Maoist, in that he for him, it's kind of the later thinkers in communism, they're a big deal to him. But before I read Marx, I basically read all of the major economic thinkers that he was derivative of, because I knew that in the history of economics, really the major discoveries and major breakthroughs are before Karl Marx. And then Karl Marx was a figure who was kind of like a commentator, drawing together those observations and making a political platform out of them. So I read Adam Smith, I read Ricardo, I read the truly classical economists, the guys who were really before liberalism meant anything. I've read some of the later liberal thinkers too, guys like I'm not going to list off all the readers. I had this very solid foundation in classical economics, including Malthus and the critique of Malthus, which is a big deal in Marxist Capital. So I was already familiar with that, including the Fable of the Bees by Mandeville. It's another major text in the history of economics. I really had this background. And reading that stuff in the first books, most of those are the first books in the English language ever to advance those ideas, they explain their ideas clearly, unlike more advanced economic textbooks. That is, they really had to explain to their audience at that time what they meant by basic terms and concepts, and how they discovered what they discovered in terms of really creating the foundations for classical economics, and that created the platform for Marx's peculiar movement. So when I finally read Karl Marx, it was laughable to me. I thought Marx was an incredibly dishonest, incredibly shallow author who was intentionally misleading his audience, who was trying to take some of the simplest concepts in economics and make them baffling, and trying to make his audience kind of wonderstruck by very simple ideas about price and wage and inflation and production and where does value come from. I mean, he has, as a stylist, he manages to make it quite, exciting to talk about economics. And I guess that's the main impact on his audience. Some people read it, and they read it with no prior background in economics, and they felt like, wow, this is the first guy to ever figure out really basic questions about wages and labor supply and money supply and prices and inflation and this kind of thing. But no, Marx didn't discover any of it, and he doesn't even do a competent or honest job providing you with an Intro to Economics 101 textbook. What he does is he writes in this highly dramatized way about what are very simple, very boring facts of economic life, and he does it in a way to try to manipulate you and radicalize you. The most fundamental idea of Marx's Das Kapital is everything is going to get worse and worse. There's nothing you can do to make it better. The conflicts he describes between employer and employee, etc. There's no way to have a ameliorative, positive approach to it. The only solution is incredibly violent revolution. That is both the implicit and explicit thesis throughout the whole book. So you can make that kind of insincere argument with anything. You could imagine today someone writing a book about global warming that way, where they only give you one side of the story. They just say, okay, these are the problems. This is how terrible and terrifying they are. There's no way to improve it technologically. There's no way to improve it democratically. There's no way to this or that. And their thesis implicitly or explicitly is there has to be some kind of terrible revolution that destroys capitalism. I think actually there are some people who are ecological extremists who write in that style. And at most points in Marx, even if you just understand the basic rudiments of economics, whenever he presents a problem as impossible to solve, you're like, well, no, that's why we have minimum wage. You're like, well, no, that's why we have labor unions. Well, no, that's why we have democracy, and we can discuss these problems. That's why we have health and safety standards in factories. That's why we have law courts where if your hand gets crushed at the factory, you can sue your employer and be given enough money to live the rest of your life because you got your hand crushed. That kind of lawsuit is, especially in the economic history of the United States, a very fundamental part of the development of the American economy and workers' rights, what have you. A lot of it hasn't come through union organization, but actually came through so-called frivolous lawsuits that really created workplace standards, transformed the way factory work happens in America, and transformed many workplaces in many ways. So at every point in reading Karl Marx, I was just wincing, and I just felt I was reading a totally insincere book that really, really was written by someone who regarded his audience as a bunch of idiots. And the tragic history of the world shows that to a large extent, he was right. Now, I do not sympathize with my own professors. We're talking about guys who are alive today, but quite elderly, who were caught up in Marx mania. And I have known many. I've known so many people with PhDs who are overawed and impressed by Karl Marx, and they're professors in many different departments. And then they spend the rest of their lives making excuses for Lenin, for Stalin, for whatever it is. It leads them into a way of thinking where all kinds of other evils outside of Marx are justified just by the respect and admiration they feel for Karl Marx and what he did basically in this one book, in Das Kapital. So again, to me, simply, that is very, very alien. If you are amazed by the quality of the writing of William Shakespeare, that really doesn't justify anything else except admiration for William Shakespeare. And I think, again, it is on that level that Marx has to sit on the bookshelf. You just have to look at him as this highly eccentric literary figure who, put together a concoction of social themes and literary themes. And yes, most of the stuff Marx writes about, he doesn't know as much as a Wikipedia article about. Karl Marx writes about the history of India. Marx knows nothing about the history of India. He writes about the history of China. What he writes even about the history of medieval Germany. He wasn't an expert on this, even by the standards of his own day at his own time. He was incredibly ignorant of all these things. He also was at best an educated layperson about economics. I think even that is flattering him. He was a dilettante, but obviously what he wrote was in some sense a literary masterpiece. People read texts like Das Kapital and Communist Manifesto and were swept up with this incredible sense of excitement. And it's really sad and tragic to reflect that it is not excitement based on optimism. It's not excitement based on reading a book that tells you, hey, the world can be a better place, poverty is a problem we can solve. Like Bernie Sanders telling you can have a minimum wage, you can have cheap healthcare, you can have affordable university, you can have peace instead of war. It's actually based on the sickest form of pessimism of Karl Marx telling you everything is going to get worse and worse and worse until one day there's this unbelievable, internecine form of warfare, class war. And the horrible reality of class war is exactly what we all saw play out in the history of the Soviet Union, Russia, China, Laos, Vietnam, and so on. Did I mention Cambodia?
Da, 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 da.